Well, I appreciate the chance to chat with you about this election. I want to stress the title of the talk, Some Sense, because I don't think anybody's capable of making sense of this election. That's far too high a bar for myself or anybody else to meet. And in particular, what I want to try to do today is step away from the 24/7 news media blather that goes on at a constant rate, talking about this and that. They're trying to make news in, getting people nervous on both sides of the aisle, whether you support Donald Trump or you support Hillary Clinton. There's all the conversations about the tape, which was from a couple of weeks ago, or now the recent release by the FBI in regards to potentially further investigations of emails. All of this certainly matters, but it's not at all clear that it's driving the election. But it's certainly driving the narrative of this campaign. And for those of you who are following a lot of the news media, it can set you off one way or the other. But what I'd prefer to do, and I'll certainly take any questions, and we'll leave lots of time to talk about this campaign once I've finished my remarks. But what I'd prefer to do is focus on what I would term the structural features of this election, the things that are really driving the campaign in ways that are above the 24/7 news media chatter that I think is in many cases uninformed. I mean, if you take, for example, the number of times the news media have claimed that Donald Trump is done as a candidate, and we had $1 for each one of those times, we would all be quite well off. And just most recently, because of the release of that unfortunate tape, and I say unfortunate because it was troubling on a lot of fronts, certainly troubling for Trump himself, people were saying, oh, he's going to drop out of the race now, he has to. That's just wrong. I mean, he obviously is still in the race, and by some standards, depending on which polls you choose to focus on, he seems to be coming up in the polls, though I'm not at all convinced that that's true. But nonetheless, I mean, you can just catalog all the news media's commentary and realize that how much they've gotten this wrong. That win or lose in the 2016 election, I suspect the real loser is the chattering class and their inability to understand what's going on. So what I'm going to do is certainly continue to be straightforward in regards to, I'm going to provide some sense of this election by focusing on these structural features. Let's see if this technology works. It does. Usually for me it doesn't. So what are some of the structural forces I want to talk about? And most of these are not going to be a surprise to you, but it's worth working through them. First is the state of the economy. We know as political scientists that the economy structures campaigns in a way that are fundamental. The fact that the economy is doing reasonably well right now, in fact, the recent GDP was at almost 3% released last week, and it's been growing for quite a while. Jobs have been created. The economy, by many measures, is doing well. If the economy was not doing well, that'd be a huge problem for Hillary Clinton. But the fact that the economy is doing well is a plus for her, and we'll talk about some other structural pluses. One thing that works very much against Hillary Clinton is the fact that Barack Obama is completing 2 terms. That means that we've had Democrats in the White House for 8 years. This country historically likes change. In fact, on average, over the course of American history, parties serve about 8.3 years in the presidency, and then they change. So we change parties every 8.3 years. In other words, every 2 terms, we switch to another party. And in fact, this is the broad conceptual point that is most important that's driving Donald Trump's campaign. This country wants change. If you take a look, for example, at the wrong track, right track question, the polling, is the country on the right track, is the country on the wrong track? It's about a 65 to 70 split, let's say 70-30 split. 70 thinks we're on the wrong track, 30% think we're on the right track. And that's a statement that this country really wants change. And Donald Trump, regardless of what you think of him, has in fact tapped into that in a very effective way, and we'll return back to that. But 2 terms is a big plus for the Republican nominee because the country instinctively wants change. So one of the great things that Barack Obama had going for him in 2008 was 8 years of rule by George Bush and the Republicans. There was a desire for change. And there was also a struggling economy. It was, in fact, structurally a campaign that was a gift to the Democrats. You would have to have been a terrible candidate not to win that contest, because you had both a struggling economy, which hurt the Republicans, plus a demand for change. And, of course, those 2 things are related. incumbent rating. That is, how popular is the current incumbent? One of the things that's really interesting that has not gotten a lot of notice in this election, obviously Barack Obama has been out on the trail along with his very talented wife as far as maybe arguably giving the most important speech of the campaign in New Hampshire a couple weeks ago on the heels of the release of the tape. Obama's ratings are up. He'd been mostly in the mid to low 40s most of his presidency. There'd been a pop-up after the takeout of Osama bin Laden, but for the most part, he had not crossed 50%. He's now well into the 50% range. He's about 55% popular, 45% unpopular. That's a big surge for him. Now, the reasons for that are partly tied to the economy. I think there's also an explanation, which Obama himself has suggested, is that the American public takes a look at our two nominees and realize he ain't so bad. And I think there's something to that. You know, it's amazing. You start to miss that thing that you really didn't like, but it turns out that, you know, by comparison, wasn't so bad. And if you think about it, somebody made a comment to me the other day that, again, regardless of policy, Michelle Obama and Barack Obama have acquitted themselves during their time in office at the highest level. I mean, there has not even been the hint of scandal in regards to their personal behavior. You know, for 8 years, that's hard. That's hard, but it's a testament to the way they conduct themselves and the way they conduct their family, and they just need, regardless, again, of partisan stripes, that needs to be applauded. Fourth thing that we want to talk about is anger. Yeah. Barack Obama has growing fan base. Fourth thing I want to talk about is the anger in this country. There is a lot of anger, and there's anger in all different ways. And the anger isn't just on the right. It's on the left as well. I mean, Bernie Sanders, captured that in a way that I don't think anybody anticipated. I suspect even he didn't anticipate the success that he would have. And so there is anger, and that anger does not know partisan stripes. It's on both sides of the aisle, and it's worth talking about and how it plays out. I do think that for the most part, Trump is able to tap into this anger more effectively than Hillary Clinton. But that, again, we'll get to. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the media and specifically making a distinction between the paid and the free media. Donald Trump has, again, at least you have to give him credit for figuring out how to do this. He's upset the apple cart in the sense that candidates used to rely heavily on the paid media. He's relying heavily on the free media, and I'll provide some data about that. It'll be really interesting to see how all this plays out. We obviously, as you know, most people, we have less now than a week to go, assuming that we actually have a winner on election night, which I suspect we will, but that's based on just, you know, past precedent. But nonetheless, this distinction is worth thinking about, and it really is different ways these two candidates have come at this election that I think is really interesting, is going to require some serious thought afterwards by journalists, but most importantly, frankly, political scientists and communication scholars. Then finally, last but not least, and I think I said free media was the last one, is I want to talk a little bit about the demographic changes in this country. None of this data is going to surprise you. You know most about these demographic shifts, but it's worth reminding ourselves about these, because these things are serious problems structurally for the Republican Party. And you can imagine what they are: Latino population, gender, et cetera. That regardless of who wins this campaign, the Republican Party really faces an unclear future. And which way it goes is obviously going to depend a huge amount about what happens with Trump in the campaign and the extent, let's say he wins narrowly, loses narrowly, or loses by a lot. That's going to shape a little bit of the direction. So these are some of the forces that I want to try to talk about and present you some data and walk through these. There will be a test on this graph after the class. And this is a very simple little chart. You don't need to worry about the details, but basically what it tells you is that since the post-World War II elections, that we can explain the presidential vote by three structural variables: the state of the economy, which I just suggested earlier, the approval of the president, which is net approval, and the final is whether you're in your first term or not. And this model predicts 90% of the vote. That is, we knew with some certainty in 2012, as early as June of 2012, that Barack Obama should get about 51, 52% of the vote. Why? Because he was in his first term, growth in GDP was reasonable, and he was not super unpopular. He was reasonably popular. The combination suggests he should get about 51% of the vote. This model, you can say there's a mix of effects for both Clinton and for Trump. Trump gains from the fact that it's a first term, it's not first term, so that does not help Clinton. In fact, hurts Clinton, helps Trump. The net approval and GDP are slight benefits to Hillary Clinton, so you have one big help for Trump, and you have two small structural helps for Clinton, and it basically predicts, which may end up being the case, a very close election. We'll talk about that at the end of the lecture, about who actually is predicted to win on this. But if you plug in all the numbers, it's no surprise it's a close election. But the reason why it's a close election is it structurally should be close, because there are forces that are working on behalf of the Republicans, there are forces working on behalf of the Democrats. Now, just to make sure you understand that when the economy is doing well, that doesn't mean that you as citizens say, oh, GDP's up by 2.5%, I'm going to vote for the incumbent. That's really not how it works out, okay? Maybe some of you do. But more likely what happens is, let's back up. I love speaking to audiences like this, because when I mentioned the name Ronald Reagan, you actually know who Ronald Reagan is. And many of you voted for Ronald Reagan or voted against Ronald Reagan, but at least you had the opportunity to cast your ballot for Ronald Reagan. In 1984, he ran what was called the Morning in America commercials. They were beautiful. They were wonderful. They made you feel good about America. He could talk about the growth of the economy. He could talk about the fact that home purchases were up, that inflation was down, the tax burden was down. All these positive things he could talk about in his ads. Why? Because they were going on. In 1984, GDP, anybody have any guess on what the percentage gain in GDP was? 7%. 7%. That is a robust economy. Now, it had been struggling in its earlier years, but in his re-election years, the economy was taking off. So he could run the Morning in America ads. He could talk about optimism. But let's backpedal 4 years earlier to 1980, when the economy was in shambles, you had high inflation, you had all these problems. Could Jimmy Carter run an optimistic campaign? No, he wasn't allowed to. So the way the economy works isn't that people directly vote on it, it structures the kind of campaign you can run. So just think about, in this course of this campaign in September, the job data was released, and I think there was over 200,000 jobs that were being produced. That helped Clinton because she could talk about that. But if you remember, I think it was May, maybe it was June, where economic growth, the number of jobs created was like 30,000. It was really small. And if that had continued, that would have been a huge burden to Clinton, because she wouldn't be able to make the argument that the economy was growing. But since that time, jobs were created. Last month in October, I think job creation was 159,000. That's pretty robust, not as great as you'd like, but it's good. Of course, this Friday will be the jobs figures for October. And it'll be really interesting to see if the job growth is up. That helps Clinton for the last couple of days, makes her case. So when I talk about the economy shaping the election, it's really shaping the kind of campaign you can run. If the economy is doing well, incumbents can run certain campaigns. If the economy isn't doing well, the challenger can then run certain campaigns. So that's the way, this is one way to think about this. Let's talk about anger. There is anger in this country. There's anger actually in a lot of democracies across a lot of the globe. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. In the United States, I think, this graph captures a lot of it. If you take a look at the middle 60%, that's the gray line, basically since 1980, incomes in that group have increased 41%. In other words, little over 1% a year has been their salary increase, in a sense. The top 1% have been getting over a 6% pay raise every year. That is systematically a huge effect. It is really allowing this very wealthy group to do really, really well. But while people who are working 2 jobs trying to send their kids to college, trying to just buy a washing machine, or maybe get a new car, whatever the case may be, they're struggling with this. And it's not part of how they were raised. The belief in America, and in many countries, but certainly in America, is that if you work hard, there's a payoff to it. And this wasn't paying off because you were dealing with 1% income growth. And that's just not enough. That's not what the American dream is about, and there's reasons for these middle-class voters to be angry. And Trump has tapped into that. He's tapped into it by talking about unfair trade deals. He's tapped into it by claiming he wants to make America great again. And people can complain about the rhetoric all they want, but he understands this in a way, and so do the Democrats. This is not a partisan issue. Some may argue, in fact, we have a gentleman on the third floor here in the Commons named Larry Bartels, who shows that the income disparities between the rich and the poor grow under Republican administrations, shrink under Democrats. It is definitely has a partisan edge to it, but this problem knows no partisan boundaries, and both parties have to deal with it. Both parties have to figure out how to control this, because this is a big part of the anger. Of course, other parts of the anger could be the changes in the country when we're talking about the demographic changes. A lot of people feel under threat. This country, you know, within the next 30 to 35 years is going to be majority minority. It's going to be true. Some people, that makes some people uncomfortable. That makes some people angry. And it's again, what Trump has tapped into. Because we know that Trump's support, there is a strong correlation between his support and kind of racial attitudes. And it is just the truth. It's not comfortable, but it's what the data show. Paid versus free media. I've studied advertising for a long time. I find this topic fascinating, and I find absolutely what's going on in this campaign really surprising, and therefore a chance to really rethink a lot of our assumptions. And I'll be presenting some of these data for you in a second. But let me talk about bullet point number 2 and then number 3 broadly, and then we'll get into the data. Presidential ads from basically 1988 to 2012, they drove the narrative. Let me give you an example. And how many people know the term swift boat? Okay, a lot of you know the term swift boat. Swift boat was a term that came out of the 2004 presidential election. It was a series of attack ads aired by the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. And that was a major component of the 2004 campaign, basically an ad that attacked John Kerry's patriotism, attacked what he had accomplished in Vietnam, and it was a big part of the campaign. Now, a little backdrop. Those ads aired to 1 million Americans, 4 states, a handful of ad buys, and only 1 million Americans saw them. You know the name, even now, 12 years later, but it is not because you saw the ad. In fact, I would bet none of you actually saw the ad unless you happened in 2004 living in Indiana, Michigan, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, and there was one other state, and I can't remember, maybe it was Iowa. You didn't see it. But what did you see? You saw the news media's coverage of it. And the news media covered it 24/7 for a long period of time. In fact, to such an extent that in September of 2004, 80% of Americans recognized the word swift boat. You make the 80% times the 200 million voters, so to speak, you're talking about a reach of 160 million people had heard the term, yet only 1 million had seen the actual ad. It's because the news media covered it. And the news media were covering ads a lot. And it started in the '88 campaign. There was a series of famous ads in '88. The tank ad, which had Michael Dukakis driving around in a tank. He looked like Snoopy. He looked ridiculous. And the Bush people took advantage of that. It was his own soundbite, his own video. It didn't work very well. There was also the Willie Horton ad. There was also Boston Harbor ad. There were some very powerful ads that shaped the narrative in '88, and it continued forward. In 2012, Romney was attacked as an out-of-touch rich guy. He had made the comment about 47%. You know, he's not worried about the 47% of Americans who are never going to vote for him, the poor Americans. It made him seem out of touch. There was an ad about that. That drove the narrative. So ads played a critical role in driving the narrative in this period of time. That's not true in 2016. Why? Because Trump drove the narrative in 2016. Trump drove it through Twitter, through speeches, through debates, through making basically very strong kinds of claims, and that's a kind word, that got the news media's attention. They couldn't help it. It's like moths to a flame. I mean, he all of a sudden attacks a Gold Star family. That gets attention. He decides to go after former Miss America? Universe. Miss Universe, right. That gets attention. He was driving the narrative. He understood that in a way that nobody else did. And he started this right away. In fact, his campaign strategy in general is just fascinating. This is a guy who's just not worked that hard to run for president. I did an event in April downtown, and Congressman Dick Gephardt was part of it. Very good guy. I'd not had a chance to meet him before. And the congressman had run for president in 1988, and he ran for president in 2004. And he was, with some grudging respect, admired what Trump had done. Because in his campaign, let's say in 2004, he said, probably not every door, but I probably knocked on nearly every door in the state of Iowa. And I worked for a year for that. He goes, what does this guy do? And he says it again with grudging respect. He gets up in the morning, he's still in his underwear, great image, and tweets. Has a cup of coffee, calls a morning talk show. They let him on. He has a phone call with them. He then, about 10 o'clock, decides to get some clothes on, and then maybe does one event, and then does some more tweets, and then has dinner, maybe does another event. It's not the kind of rigorous schedule that presidential candidates normally keep up. It is a very tiring undertaking. Anybody, and even Trump is working hard at this point in time, but he had a knack for getting a lot of attention through very different kinds of means, basically using the free media. He understood it. He understood that this popularity that he had was due to his television show, largely, though he had been in the public eye from time to time. But he got this. And so he's changed how we think about it. I want to present you some data. I had that first comment about the one-sided message and by Clinton. And the real question is has Trump recast the information flow in this country? We can't answer that question now. It'll depend a lot on whether he wins or not. Because one thing about American politics, and I think it's true in any country, winners look like geniuses, losers look like idiots. And it's always unfair. You take the 2000 campaign. Lots of people have criticized Al Gore for not campaigning hard enough in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee was never in the ballpark for Gore. They never thought that. They never campaigned very hard here because they knew it was likely to be a red state. You can criticize Gore all you want for it, but the bottom line is that he was focusing on other states to win the Electoral College, and Tennessee was not part of it. Of course, in a close election like 2000, any one state could be determinative. So, for example, he barely lost the state of New Hampshire. If he'd advertised more in New Hampshire, he probably could have flipped New Hampshire to him. But that's after the fact. But so Bush, who doesn't even win the popular vote, Karl Rove's a genius. Karl Rove was not a genius. Karl Rove invested heavily at the end of the campaign in California for reasons that nobody understands. He could have invested in Florida. He didn't. But because they win the election, Rove looks like the genius. Romney doesn't look like a very good campaigner. I think Romney ran a perfectly fine campaign in 2012. And by the way, by comparison to what's going on now, we want to put a picture up on Mount Rushmore, right? This has made, we long for Mitt Romney. Okay, just think that through. We've come a long way. So we'll see if Trump recasts it. But if he wins, there's certainly a chance he'll be doing so. So let's talk a little bit about campaign ads. These data are up to October 1st, so I don't have from October, but it's not going to change very much. So from June to the end of September, over 200,000 campaign ads have been aired. We now know that the number overall of campaign ads are down from 2012. That is collectively both candidates, and you'll see it's mostly Trump, are investing less in campaign ads this campaign than they had in 2012. But of course, where are they focusing on? No surprise. They're focusing on Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. That's hardly a surprise. Except on national cable, none of us here in the state of Tennessee have seen an ad directly aimed at the voters of this state. We may get getting picked up in ads aired during the Olympics or some national cable show, but we're not seeing ads aired at us. They're being aired in the battleground states because Tennessee is not a battleground state. Trump will win the state by 10 plus points. We'll see exactly how it plays out. This is the most amazing statistic that continues to be true to this very day. Clinton is outspending and out advertising Trump about 4-1 in the battleground states. 4-1. That's a huge gap. It's unprecedented in the television era. There was, in the 68 campaign, Humphrey ran out of money in the last week and did not able to buy ad as much as Nixon. And so there was a kind of a one-sided message at the end of the campaign. But prior to that, it was very equal. And the data that we do have suggests it's 52-48, 51-49, very close. But here, it's 82% Democrat, 18% Republican. This is unprecedented. And it could lead, if you believe in the power of ads, it could mean that Clinton could buck the trend nationally and do very well in the battleground states. And so I don't think this has happened, but it's not, or will happen, but it's not impossible that Trump might eke out a small victory in the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. You know, you just think about it. I mean, unbelievable. And and he would claim the system's rigged, and we would show as many tapes of Al Gore acknowledging that a conceding defeat after the Electoral College, the court made this decision, even though he'd won the popular vote. But Trump would not do that. It would be, and Clinton would become president. We don't have to have Trump's concession, but it would be ugly. From my point of view, modestly entertaining, and I say modestly because I think at a certain point it would start to drive me nuts. This is data from the spring, and so it's not up to date, but it basically accomplishes the point I want to say. Trump spent in the spring about $10 million on paid ads. He got the equivalent of almost $2 billion worth of free media coverage. This is what you call ROI. I mean, seriously, if you think about what he did, look at poor Jeb Bush. He spends $82 million, he got 214. It's about basically less than a 3-to-1 ratio. Look at the ratio of Trump. This is Trump's genius. This is the kind of evidence that suggests that he has been able to dominate the free airwaves. Now, when you get your message out in the free media, you can get a lot of coverage, you can get a lot of bang for your buck, all like that. But there is one problem with it. You don't control the message. With paid ads, at least you can tell what you're going to say, and you can control that. But the free media can't. So Trump is a genius at that, but of course what he gets frustrated by is the coverage isn't what he would like it to be. But that's true for every single candidate. There's no candidate who doesn't complain about the news media's coverage of them. It's always viewed as unfair by the candidates. But this is an amazing graph. And it's true today. Obviously, when you get down to two candidates, Hillary Clinton's getting a lot of attention and a lot of free coverage as well. But Trump's genius is that, and every tweet that he sends out, it's really quite remarkable. And again, from a structural point of view or from just a broadly political point of view, you have to tip your hat to this insight that he had. None of the other candidates had it. Let's talk about demographics now, the last piece before and we'll go through all the data. Most of this will be broadly known to you, and then we can take some questions and see if we can make even a little more sense out of this contest. This was in 2012. As I said earlier, Barack Obama won 51% of the vote, Mitt Romney won 48%. This is the distribution of the states. It was not a very close battle in the Electoral College, 332 states. 332 votes went to Obama. Florida itself, some of you may remember, was absolutely nip and tuck. Obama won it by half a percentage point. And so if you take those 29 votes out, it becomes a closer election. But nonetheless, Obama won with some comfort. Oops, I'm playing animation. I don't know what I'm doing there. Oh, I guess I did it right. So let's talk about some of the demographic shifts that we saw in 12 and then think them through about what's going to happen in 16. Obama won the female vote by 10 percentage points in 2012. Again, you all know that there's a gender gap that favors the Democrats. This puts a number on it. Given the rhetoric of this campaign, this is going to be larger in 2016. There's no way it's not going to be. Younger voters, Obama won by 23 points. This is a little bit less clear. Trump, in the class, I'm teaching a big elections class with Josh Clinton, who I guess spoke to you, or at least some of you earlier in the term, Bruce Oppenheimer as well. He spoke to you about Congress, and then John Meacham as well as part of that team. And our students are really, those who support Trump, they're really quiet about it. They don't feel like they can talk about it. There's one student, and I give him a lot of credit. He's a conservative. He's proud of that. He talks about how he's going to vote for Trump. He's not wild about Trump, but he cares about the Supreme Court, and that's what he's going to do. And you have to respect that. But collectively, the students are really anti-Trump here. They're really anti-Trump. But they're not all that wild about Clinton. I mean, that, in fact, my view is that these millennials fell in love with a 74-year-old socialist from Vermont who was bald with white hair. Yes, 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 yes. There's a future for me. And I have a home in Vermont, too, by the way. I just want you to know that. I haven't become a socialist yet, but, we'll give it time, I suppose. But the millennial vote is a little unclear. They're certainly not happy with Trump, but they're not wild about Clinton either. I'm not sure where this will come down. I suspect that Clinton will lead among millennials at the end of the day, but probably similar. I don't see that it's going to be a difference. This is a missed opportunity for the Democrats because Trump has really turned off the youth of the country for the most part, but Clinton has not seized that moment. African Americans, this is no surprise. Obama won the African American community basically by 87 points. It was, he got over 90% of the vote. It's interesting to see, Trump makes rhetorical flourishes every once in a while, if you want to call them that, about the African American community and getting support in the black community. I don't see it happening. In fact, there's been some public opinion polls where you have 1,000 people being interviewed. Not one African American is willing to say they're going to vote for Trump. I mean, literally 0%. And that's just an indication. It's not that no African Americans will vote for Trump. It's just a very small percentage. Clinton may end up doing better among blacks than Obama, largely because Romney did have some appeal to the African American community. I think Trump almost has none. And this is a problem. And it's a problem going forward because this is a block of voters, not 15% of the country, that's reliably Democratic. It's a firm base for the Democrats. The Republicans would love to peel some of that base off. But this election is not helping them. Latino voters, people are well aware of this. Again, 47-point win by Obama over Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney in particular got 27% of the Latino vote. I just do not see how it is possible for Trump to do better than 27%. Just don't see it given his rhetoric. There is some indication that in some states like Florida that some of the early voting, the Latino community has been turning out. But it's also true that people have been touting a big turnout by the Latino community and it hasn't yet happened. So we'll see how this plays out. But again, this is definitely a plus for Clinton, largely because of the kind of rhetoric for Trump. And the long-term consequences for the Republican Party is really very much a question. And if Trump becomes president, it would be ironic that if he wins, he could ensure that the Republican Party is a minority party forever. It's an exaggeration, but you see my point, that if he then goes out and acts on some of this rhetoric, that's going to further polarize the country and make it very hard for him to build any kind of winning coalition. This is a group that needs more attention that we don't spend enough time at, is Asian Americans. Asian American community has suddenly moved very much to the Democratic side. And it is a growing piece of the American electorate in ways that don't get enough attention. And it's part of why we're going to be a majority-minority country isn't just the Latino growth, it's also Asian Americans. They're growing at a very steep rate, and they're very strongly in the Democratic camp. I've not seen enough compelling data to show that this is going to be larger, but I suspect it will be larger in this camp for Clinton, but we'll see. So this is a kind of a summary of it. In 1976, 89% of voters were white. That's down to 72% in 12, and it's probably going to be about 70% in this campaign in 2016. And that's just not good news for the Republicans. That structural force is not good. This is something that surprised me, but you would expect the country's 50-50 as far as gender goes, right, approximately. But by 2016, people think that the electorate will be 54% female. It was 53% in 12. That's just, again, not good news for the Republicans, especially given this campaign. We had, in the course of this elections campaign that we taught, a woman named Sally Bradshaw, who has Vanderbilt ties, came to speak to us. And Sally Bradshaw was very major figure in the Jeb Bush campaign, also worked for 41 and 43, and she came to speak to us because basically it was kind of like the confessions of a Republican. It was really great for the class because it was a therapy session for all those Republicans that didn't know what to do, because she couldn't vote for Trump. Her reasons were just simply that I have 4 daughters, and he is not a role model for my daughters. I'm not supporting Trump. She had not yet come out for Clinton. The tape, when that was released, she then announced her support for Clinton. But this is a microcosm of what's going on in a lot of quarters. In fact, there was an article, I think it was in the Times or the Post, it might even been in Wall Street Journal, that female Republicans in particular just feel adrift. And I think that's not true for every single one, but again, it speaks to this. And with this electorate increasing in size, and that's another structural advantage to the Democrats. This is just the growing share of Hispanic vote, the eligible vote versus the actual voters. As you can see that, and when I say eligible, that's the people who actually can vote. But obviously the turnout in the Latino community, people kept waiting for it to surge. It really hasn't. The share of Latinos who can vote but don't is really pretty high. Maybe this election will be different, but that gap has been wide, and I suspect it'll be wide again. But there'll be more, there'll be 13 million or so at least Latino votes in 2016, and the overwhelming ones are going to support Clinton. And it's making a state like Texas potentially in play. I cannot imagine Texas going to Clinton. But if it does, I mean, that'll be a sign of a major blowout in the Electoral College. But the fact that it's even being discussed is a product of these kinds of demographic changes. This is just a small shout out, I suppose, for George W. Bush. George W. Bush, again, holding aside partisan views, George W. Bush understood that the Republican Party had to become a multicultural coalition if they were going to be majority party. He got that. Karl Rove, who I was teasing about earlier, got that. And George Bush, having been governor of Texas, understood it and was comfortable in doing so and really worked hard and did pretty well among Latino voters. And that trend could have continued. But after the 2004 victory, when he tried to do immigration reform, his right wing said no. And ever since then, the proportion has been declining. So there was a moment when the Republicans could have done really well in the Latino community. It would have been a big boom. If they'd have done anywhere near like they had in 2012, like Bush, Romney would have won. But they didn't. But it does mean that the right kind of rhetoric, the right kind of policies could lure this group back. There are lots of reasons to think the Latino community many parts of it would feel comfortable within kind of traditional Republicanism. But we're not even sure what traditional Republicanism is going to look like after this campaign, of course. So what does this mean for, when you take it all together, the Democrats, and again, most of you in the audience, you'll remember that in the 1980s, the Republicans were the ones that had the lock on the Electoral College. They were the ones that started out in this huge advantage. And that's no longer true. The Democrats are the ones that have the built-in advantage. And if you think about it, 18 states, the Democrats have won 6 times in a row, which gives them 242 electoral votes as kind of a baseline. That is an amazing start, because you only need 270, whereas the Republicans have a base of 102 electoral votes. And so it is just an edge. When you count California and New York and Illinois firmly in your camp, that gives you a big edge in the college right there. And those states, I mean, I saw one poll that had Clinton up by 20 in New York. She's up by 16, 17 in Illinois. And I mean, my guess is she's up by 20 or more in California. I mean, it's just not close in those states. But this is, been a big change. Now, it doesn't mean the Democrats will have this edge in the long run, because we know politics changes. Just like California used to vote with some frequency with the Republicans, and you had this Republican lock in the Electoral College, that's all flipped. It could flip again. It's the nature of politics. So, who wins? Who knows? I mean, you got to put your money on Clinton, despite all the blather right now, the sinking of the polls. The really good polls aren't showing this kind of sinking going on. I'll talk about that in a second. But if you plug in those values that I talked about in that first chart that we're going to have a little test on afterwards, it basically assumes Trump wins by about half a percentage point. Basically predicts Trump wins about 50.3% of the vote. The Democrat wins 49.7%. But that model assumes equally qualified candidates and equal amounts of resources. And how do you cut that? Well, first of all, you know, we have arguably the two least popular presidential candidates in the modern era running at the same time. At least if you look at polling data, that's no debate. Some of you may be huge, you know, Hillary supporters, and I understand why that, but across the country, she's just very unpopular. But Trump's a little less popular, which is, so maybe they're not equally qualified, but again, you have to figure out what you mean by that. And then on equal amount of resources, Hillary's spending a lot more on paid ads, which is a plus for her, but he's getting a lot more free media, which depending on the tone may or may not be a plus for him. So, and to move this election very much, you've got to have a big gap in that. And so even if you believe that Hillary Clinton's, you know, when I say qualified, I mean the public's reaction to the candidate. I think from just a resume point of view, it's hard to argue that Hillary Clinton is not qualified. But it's also true that being qualified doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a great president. In fact, if you look at the correlation between our scales of presidential greatness and how many years of political experience they had prior, it's a negative correlation, okay? Because Abraham Lincoln had almost no prior political experience. One term in Congress was his higher political experience. Richard Nixon had huge amounts of political experience. And so you go through, it's not clear that that relationship works very much. But nonetheless, if you just think about it from the quality of the candidates that the public perceives, Clinton has a small edge, but not a huge edge. And this email thing certainly put a bit of a damper on some of that. And then finally, as I said, equal amount of resources depends on how you cut it. So, you know, you've got, it's going to be close. It's going to be, it remains an interesting race. We'll see what kind of blather comes out of the news media in the last week. But structurally, the Democrats have an edge, and I would put my money on the fact that that will carry through on Election Day. But it's also true, and this is true for myself and everybody else that I know that comments on politics, that in June of 2000 or July of 2015, nobody thought Donald Trump would do very well, including myself. It wasn't until January when I realized he was going to get the nomination, which was earlier than most, but it was, you know, anytime during the fall, you know, he attacks McCain, you know, is not a hero. I mean, game over. John McCain's many things, but he is an American hero. Nope, that didn't do it. You know, and then he saddles up to the KKK. Game over. Nope. I mean, you know, the man's that gives Teflon a whole new meaning. And so, you know, it's hard to be sure, but nonetheless, these are the kind of structural forces. You've at least had about 45 minutes break from the news media. So you're all in a little bit better place psychologically, and so I'll be sending you my bill. And with that, I will take any and all questions. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, the question for those of you who couldn't hear is basically, I'll paraphrase it and see if I get it right. Is there a hidden Trump vote in the polls? Of course, the answer is it could be. The problem with that hypothesis is that Trump's support has been pretty well calculated in the primaries. There wasn't some hidden Trump vote there. And I don't know that, you know, the people I know who like Trump, you know, they're kind of appalled that I might consider voting for Hillary Clinton. They can't possibly understand it. So they're, you know, I don't think that's the case. But again, you know, it could be true, but we don't see any of it. There's been a lot of speculation, especially in racial attitudes. There'd be a hidden vote. People would say they're going to vote for the black candidate, but then they don't. And that did happen sometimes in the 70s and the 80s. But again, like Obama's preference, it was a pretty good predictor. There wasn't any hidden racial vote out against Obama. People were, in many cases, alas, far too explicit about, you know, their own racism. Yes, sir.
You talked about Trump's use of Twitter and the use of term information flow.
Mm-hmm.
We already were suffering from, you know, a populace that really relied too heavily on sound bites for decision making. And now, isn't this even a greater dumbing down of the political dialogue in terms of people being able to make decisions based on real policy or real platforms?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of responses to that. Let me just make sure people heard the question, that this campaign has been, and I'm again paraphrasing, so expand, if I need to expand on it. This campaign's been devoid of policy, that there's been a dumbing down going on, and that without that discussion of policy, the country's in worse shape. And this is obviously potentially a bad thing, and it is a potentially bad thing. I would argue, yes, that the depth of the policy discussion in this campaign has not been, very good, because Trump doesn't know anything. I mean, that's just the truth. I mean, it's not a partisan statement, and he's kind of proud of it. I had my friend John Meacham spent an hour with Trump, and Trump's proud of the fact, he goes, I don't read books, that's what you do. Yeah, that's true. But I just I want my candidates to at least crack a book. But that's just me. So I think that's true, and I don't think this campaign has done really well on those kind of standards. But on average, the candidates have an incentive to duck the hard issues. So that's always been true, especially when you have two parties. The tough issues like income inequality, you might never see any discussion about because both parties are screwing up on it. So that happens. I think the other thing the broader point to think about as far as the dumbing down is that there is a reliance on sound bites. You're right about that, but I think that's always been true in politics, even prior to television. So let's go back in time, and when television first came on the scenes, and many of you will remember this, it was going to ruin American politics. It was going to turn to the soundbite. It was going to move away from the more substantive discussions in the past, like when FDR promised a New Deal for the American people. I don't know what that meant, but that was a soundbite that got a lot of attention. That was 1932. Or Harry Truman offering a fair deal. What exactly was behind those things? They were pretty vaguely described. So I'm not sure there was a great heyday, and I think soundbites have always been part of American politics. And the medium of communication always causes nervousness for people when it changes. So right now, a lot of us think back on television as the golden era. But at the time when it came about, it was horrific. It was going to change. It was going to ruin politics. And the internet, is it going to ruin politics? I think it changes things in important ways, that information now isn't just coming from down top. Like, in the era of television, Walter Cronkite kind of gave us a sense of what was going on most evenings. That's not true anymore. We're getting information from the sides, from the bottom, from the top. We're awash in it, and we can also select the information we get. So that if you're a liberal, you can get liberal-only information. And if you're a conservative, you can get conservative-only information. I mean, every once in a while, somebody will ask me a question. I'll just say, stop reading what you're reading. You need to read a little bit more broadly. I can remember in 2012, a friend of mine, very intelligent, that heard a rumor, if Barack Obama loses this election, he's going to call out the military to maintain himself as president. Really? Really? You really think that? I mean, you need to stop reading whatever you're reading. That's just craziness. That's just craziness. So I think that in general we're frustrated by campaigns, and I don't think they come up. And I would agree with you that this one's worse. But it's also true that these new mediums of communication has really empowered a lot of people to be part of the process that they weren't before. And they tend to be more on the extremes. Because who's going to get involved in politics? Somebody who cares about it, who tends to be more ideological on both sides. So that's arguably a bad thing, but there is more engagement. And so we have to try to think carefully about the standards, and then also realize that the past wasn't necessarily always as wonderful as we tend to think it is. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. First of all, I was told that Obama had Anthony Scalia killed so that appointed Obama to the Supreme Court.
He caused him to smoke for all those years.
Yeah. Second of all, do you think the press failed to really vet Trump enough that sometimes they were so caught up, bothered by the outrageous statement, that they just let him escape, and they never really looked into him as a serious candidate until too late?
I think that's worth thinking about, and I think you may be right about that. I also think that I was doing an interview earlier today, and somebody was asking basically the same kind of question: have the news media failed us in this case? Well, first of all, that question has a partisan edge to it right away, so that I always worry a little bit about that. But we all have our partisan stripes. I think there's a belief that if you make a gaffe, you make a mistake, that gets you a lot of bad coverage and hurts your candidacy and all like that. And that's because the news media investigated, they talk about it a lot. But Trump made gaffes every day, okay? And in some sense, he overloaded the system. There's almost like the new Trump rule is that if you're going to make one gaffe, make 10. because then they can't focus on it on the one gaffe. And I think that I think there's a certain element to that this has been such a crazy election with so many different things. I mean, how many people you really cozying up to the KKK, attacking John McCain as a coward, attacking a Gold Star family, Miss Universe, right? I mean, or the judge in San Diego who's not legitimate because he's. I mean, well, he was born in Indiana, but I think he was in California, right? Doesn't matter. But the point is, he's an American, but he's not qualified because he has Hispanic roots. I mean, you would think any of those would be huge problems. But, the people who are angry, they want change, and they just want the apple cart upset. And it is true that Trump would clear out a lot of things. The establishment Republican Party, he'd be clearing them out. He would upset and for some people, people just want change, and that's what it's all about. So they don't really care about those specifics. And so I think the news media probably have let their guard down a little bit. And I think they're very self-reflective, and they'll be more on guard next time. But that doesn't necessarily do us any good now. But let's take the recent FBI situation. The media have to cover that. That's not. They're doing their job on that. Now, one can arguably complain, as many do on both sides of the aisle, about the FBI's decisions and Comey's decision, and I think that's all fair game. But that wasn't a news media problem. The news media have a responsibility to cover it. And, and now we have so many different sources of information. That's the other problem. What I view the single biggest structural problem this campaign poses for me is that in the past, attacks and criticism have had some evidentiary base. There's been some truth to them. John Kerry did flip-flop a little bit. John Kerry's record on Vietnam was a bit checkered because he came back after getting those medals and questioning the investment in Vietnam, et cetera. Those are legitimate questions, okay? You may be pro-Kerry, whatever, that doesn't matter, but they're legitimate. It's legitimate to suggest that Romney is a rich guy out of touch. It's legitimate to suggest that Bill Clinton was Slick Willie. I mean, all those are fundamentally legitimate things. But what Trump has done is made claims that have no evidentiary base. That's what stuns me. I mean, when he makes a claim about Clinton starting the birther movement, that's insanity. I mean, it's just not true. Or he'll make claims about the Middle East. I think that personally what worries me. And on both the left and the right, there is a tendency to ignore evidence. And we absolutely have to have politics based on some set of facts that we share. You go back, I was talking about the '64 campaign. It was a tough campaign. Barry Goldwater was hammered in a lot of ways. But Barry Goldwater's rhetoric, good or bad, at least had a basis and a set of facts. That's not true here, and that's what worries me about the system. Yeah.
Because of the dislike of the two candidates, isn't it more evident that we might not get the turnout that each party really needs to get anywhere within each state, because people are turned off from both candidates?
Yeah, the turnout, the question is about turnout, given the fact that these candidates are not exactly high on anybody's, well, obviously some people love both candidates, but they're not popular collectively, that should lead to lower turnout. And that's plausible, and it may be the case, but early voting suggests just the opposite. That is, that there's two motivations for turnout. One is that you're attracted to Hillary Clinton or you're attracted to Donald Trump and you want to vote. The other reason you vote is you're horrified by the other side and you vote for that reason. So I think in the end, if I were to bet, I'd say turnout's going to be up a little bit, but it could, but the best bet is it's going to be flat. It'll still be about the same rate because people who vote again and again and again. It's habit. Trump's argument that I'm going to turn out all this vote, it's basically, not very well educated white men. That's just not a big base to build on. And he'd have to have huge turnouts in that section, and maybe he'll get that, and that's a possibility. But I think in general, turnout will probably be up a little bit. The Clinton campaign is very organized in the battleground states for turnout efforts, and so I guess Florida, is it Dade County? I think it's Dade County, looks really good for Clinton right now, and that will help. But it may be, I early voted this year, which I normally don't. I like kind of being there on election day. But I thought, I just thought, maybe it's going to be a little ugly. And so maybe people are turning out more in early voting because they want to avoid that. If that's true, then what I just said, your hypothesis may well be true.
Because the millennials particularly are not particularly attractive.
Well,
to vote.
millennials never vote. They're a problem. Don't you agree? My wife's on a tirade against millennials these days. That's partly because we have like 4 of them.
When you were talking about the percentage of women voters having risen, do you think that's because there are more women and more women are head of household and more women are feeling empowered
Yep.
as
That's
citizens?
that's part of it, absolutely. I don't know what the exact, because women live a little longer than men, there's slight edge just in the population in general.
Or are born?
Right, yeah, slight edge on that as well. And so I think that's part of it. I also think the engagement is the case. And in this election, this is an election that's had a big gender component. One thing we haven't talked about, or more accurately, I haven't talked about, is Hillary Clinton has broken an important barrier in this country. And this is not to be underestimated. And it's got lost in all the blather that's gone on because of the emails, because of the tapes, because of Trump, et cetera. And one thing that did happen when Obama broke the barrier and then won, if you remember back in 2008, I was struck by this. People like Jesse Jackson or John Lewis, they were, crying because they didn't think it would ever happen. And I suspect for many of you, especially, women in the audience who have gone through all these tough times, it will be a moment for all of you. It'll be interesting to see what kind of result that has happened. Even somebody who's on the other side of the aisle, but seeing a woman president has got to have some sort of an effect. And I think that conversation will be something that will be talked about post-election if Hillary wins, which will be a good way to, as a starting point, to try to get the country back together, because there's more healing to do in this campaign than there has been in others. Yes, ma'am.
Why do you feel that the fact that we've had 15 years using our blood and treasure in the Middle East, it's hardly come up at all in the election?
The question is, why hasn't the Middle East come up, given the 15 years of blood being spilt there? It gets to the point, neither side really wants to talk about it. And Trump doesn't know enough to talk about it, truthfully. Hillary Clinton does. Again, being super knowledgeable about policy doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good president. But Clinton knows about all this stuff. And there's also things like Benghazi and stuff she didn't want to deal with. It's also true that I think she's a little more, I know she's more hawkish than Obama. And so that she has an incentive not to talk as much about that. But American elections tend to be about the economy. And then, of course, Trump has introduced immigration and other things like that. But it's a frustration that people have. There's a lot of important issues that have not been talked enough about, and we've had debates that haven't really advanced that as well. Over here on the side.
You used the word healing after the election. Would you speak a little to what will be the state of affairs post-election?
Yeah, the questions about what's going to be after the election. Well, look, some of the hot tempers aren't going to ease. There's still going to be a lot of anger. We'll see what happens on election day. It'll also depend on the grace of the candidates. Maybe say, look, I'm going to be an optimist. Maybe Trump will be, he's not going to be kind, but he might try to help. What does he want to accomplish? That's the big unknown. Let's say he loses. What's his next step? What's he want to do? Does he want to make money? Yes, he wants to make money. Does it do through Trump TV? Does he continue to be a candidate? Does he form a rival party? All of those are possibilities. I think that the campaign is tired Americans. I think people want it to be over. I think that Hillary Clinton has a chance to bring a lot of that together if she wins. I think Donald Trump will want to bring people together as well if he wins. And I think Hillary Clinton will be much more gracious because it's just her style compared to Trump. But even after the 2000 campaign, and that was a tough campaign. And at the end of the day, that campaign, the winner was determined by partisanship. the Supreme Court made a decision that was not consistent with what you'd normally do, but it was a partisan decision. There were 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court, 4 Democrats. That drove the process. And there was a lot of anger about that. Al Gore, in a patriotic act, accepted that and didn't agree with it, but accepted it. And it took the country a while to get back to come back together, and Bush did not start out at a high point. I would be surprised if Hillary Clinton has a long honeymoon. But it's, we'll see. It also depends on who controls the Senate. That'll make a difference. So I still think it's going to take some time. And I just hope that, people understand the stakes and try to work at it. But, I may be too optimistic. Yes, ma'am.
Other countries have a less protracted election process.
Yep. So the question is, we have a long campaign, and we're all tired of it, et cetera. And it is long, and could we shorten it? Well, empirically, we do have a long campaign. That's partly because we have a set election. Like in Britain, you might all of a sudden call an election, and then you have a certain number of days to campaign. I was noticing in the newspaper, I didn't realize this about Japan, but their campaigns are about 15 days. I'm not sure we want to do away with the long campaign. The reason we don't want to do away with the long campaign is it is a test of the mettle of these candidates. Anybody who thinks that Hillary Clinton isn't up for health-wise for this task is just silly. She's a woman of amazing energy. And I think physically that's true for Trump too. I mean, despite the fact that I don't think he's been high energy on the campaign as far as the number of events, he's worked hard. But the real advantage of it is it tests you. So imagine if we'd only had a campaign of 4 weeks. We might not have found out about things like the tape or the email, et cetera. It gives a chance for things to come up. It also gives us a chance to test whether someone's able to be president. And the best example of that is Barack Obama. Barack Obama had a very short vita. His resume was not a long one when he took the oath of office in January. But we did know one thing. He had campaigned for well over a year. He had campaigned against a very formidable candidate in Hillary Clinton. He campaigned against another very formidable candidate in John McCain, and he won both those battles. And he made almost no serious mistakes. So I would argue that that campaign, that long campaign that seemed so drawn out, provided collectively the information to say, yeah, this guy's up for the task. So if we have really short campaigns, we don't get a chance to vet as much. Now, whether we're too long, that's a different thing. But this is not new in American politics. We're here in the great state of Tennessee in 1824 after this corrupt deal between, I'm blanking on, John Quincy Adams, and then Henry Clay, thank you, from just to the north of here, making Clay the Secretary of State and denying Jackson the presidency, even though he had done better in the Electoral College and the popular vote. Jackson started his campaign for president for 1928, right away. So that was a long campaign. So it's been part and parcel of American politics because we have set dates, we know the time in between them, and you can be sure that after Wednesday morning, a week from this morning, there'll be all the discussion about who won, and there'll be discussion about who's running in 2020. Absolutely will be. And it'll be, we'll see how, Mike Pence will be talked about if Clinton wins, and of course if the Democrats face a big problem if Hillary Clinton wins, because the split that's been covered up between the Sanders wing and the Clinton wing will come out in full bloom. And so, that'll be a discussion. But that's part of it. And that's a somewhat unorthodox view. But I also think we need to think it's be very hard to change things because of the way our electoral system is set up. But I do just want to say there are some upsides to the long campaign. Yes, sir.
If Trump were to win, you consider 3 factors. First, in the Congress, the Democrats would be against him. A sizable portion of the Republicans in the Congress would probably be against him. And Pence is a much more respected person. Will there have ever been a president who is such impeachment bait?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised just to flip the coin if Hillary Clinton becomes president, that there's going to be efforts to impeach her based on some of this email stuff. So there is going to be a lot of angst on both sides, whoever happens to win. I think that if Trump wins, the issue isn't domestic policy. I think Congress kind of handles that, and he's going to be, he'll get something. It's foreign policy. And it isn't that he'll have good people in charge, I would think. I mean, imagine, for example, someone like Bob Corker or whatever is Secretary of State. I mean, that's going to give a certain level of credibility to the office. The problem is, I think, if Trump wins, is that there are going to be situations that will arise as crises because people want to test him. No one's going to need to test Hillary Clinton. She's been tested. They know what they're getting with her. Trump's a bit of a wild card, and he reacts with his gut in a lot of ways. Now, maybe in a decision-making setting like that, he'd be different. But I think we'll have 2 or 3 additional crises that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And how are those handled and dealt with? That's what worries me. The domestic policy and stuff, he'll get some of what he wants done. Hillary Clinton will get some of what he wants. It's really much more foreign policy that I worry about. It just creates uncertainty. Maybe he'll be a master at it.
Well, 2 things. One's a statement, one's a question. I have a friend that's a senior editor at one of the major news outlets who's on the campaign bar on the 8th floor. And he goes, basically for them, it was like a night at work, that they weren't with their families and they had to truck all the way over there. And they wrote the stories, but they're not as passionate as you would think. And the other one, do you think being investigated by the FBI might have some impact on the election? I mean, we have a president that is coming over with a cloud like that.
Well, I think the email situation in general poses. I'm sorry. What? Oh, the question is what? Make sure I have this right. The question is, isn't this email situation going to affect the outcome of the election? Excuse me?
What was the statement?
The statement was about an. I
I know someone who's on the debate floor all the time, and basically him and everybody else, their colleagues, are just thinking of the debates, but it is a time away from home. And they're not, because they have to run all this stuff out, they're not neutral when it's a job.
Yeah.
So they're not going in there as a passion.
No, they're not. That's what they should be doing, right? I mean, that's what the Fourth Estate's supposed to be about. Is the email scandal going to make a difference? It's making a difference in the behavior of the candidates, for sure. It's energized Trump, and it's caused Clinton to play defense. I just don't think it's going to change many votes. I don't think it's really new information. I mean, heck, if the tape didn't change many votes, this I don't think is. It gets back to the earlier point that I think people are largely baked in, that there's a very small number of people who are genuinely undecided. And those undecided, if someone's undecided at this point in time, okay, but
Editorial cartoon this morning's Tennessee.
no, I didn't.
Undecided voters.
I'll check it out. My paper came late this morning, so I didn't get a chance to look at it. But I think and those people probably won't turn out very much. There are a group of people who, especially kind of, moderate Republicans who, the idea of voting for Clinton is just like, I can't believe it. And then at the same time, they don't want to vote for Johnson because he's not very credible. It'd be interesting if we had a more serious third-party candidate. Bill Weld, if you flip the ticket, Bill Weld is a serious intellect, and it would have been interesting. He would have done better. But again, one thing that our two parties can't agree on is we don't want any other parties. And so that they create rules that disenfranchise them, and we've seen the effect of this, because I think this would have been an election kind of like 92 in Perot, where a third party could have had a serious impact. Yes, ma'am, and I'll go to you.
Would you talk about polls and how the art of polling, especially with a lot of cell phones and no brown lines?
Well, polling, and you heard from Josh, and he may have talked about that early on, but basically polling today can be done very well, but it's very expensive. So at the Vanderbilt poll, we now have 60% of our calls are cell phones, 40% are landlines. If you do a landline-only call, it's a disaster. That's why robo-polls, these are the mechanical ones, they really are just complete crap because they don't do cell phones by law. So, and then think about 18 to 29-year-olds who have a landline who answer that phone. Okay? And then you have to use those people to generalize to all 18 to 29-year-olds. And these people are whack jobs, right? I mean, they're just like not representative of anything. So those polls are garbage. But you can do it, but you have to do, as you said, you have to have a lot of cell phone because people are just not using landlines anymore. You also have to do a lot of callbacks because people who are at home are different than people who aren't at home or people who answer the phone. And you have to have good data to weight because you want to make sure you have the right demographics. So there are ways to do good polling. The problem is that you can do really cheap polling and get attention, and it's garbage. I mean, because you can do these robo-polls for like $2,000, $3,000. We're spending, holding aside the time and effort of staff and faculty, we're spending over $50,000 just for individual polls just to do the survey. And so, if you think about a poll that's being done all the time, like a tracking poll or whatever, it's garbage. The real problem in this poll, one of the big problems in this particular era, and I'm sure Josh talked about it, and some of you may have missed that talk anyways, but basically is polling is a science, basically, but figuring out who the likely voters are, it's a lot of artwork. And so those measures that are giving importance to enthusiasm, I worry about, because right now they're showing a big gain by Trump because Trump's voters and himself are energized by this recent news. The Clinton supporters are a little down, and so all of a sudden it looks like the polling, but on election day, the voting is still going to be the same. You may be right now, if all of a sudden some new poll came out, let's say a videotape came out with Trump doing something egregious, which is on videotape, as opposed to he said, she said kinds of exchanges. I mean, that's another example of just, argument by assertion. He has no evidentiary base for it, but it's also true that these are just claims, so innocent till proven guilty, I guess.
We have time.
But I think the enthusiasm is driving some of this. So I wouldn't, I'd be very, like the stock market, those of you who pay attention to the ups and downs of the stock market will make you crazy. Ups and downs of polls, that'll make you crazy. Focus on the underlying trends and you'll be, again, psychologically more healthy, yes.
With North Carolina being such a battle state, battleground state, can you speak to the recent discussion about the purging of electoral registration records?
Yeah, I mean, the questions about North Carolina and the purging of registration records and the fact that that's an argument for decreasing Democratic vote. This is going on in a lot of different states in a lot of ways because there's, the photo ID laws, et cetera. We know that has a discriminatory impact, and it's a big problem. And in a close election, those kinds of things matter. It's also true the Clintons out-organized in North Carolina dramatically over Trump. So, it's things to worry about. And we can focus, it's a close election. We can, let's say it's down to the, one state and somebody wins or loses. We're going to be able to identify 20 things that could have turned the tide. I think the broader question is, access to the ballot and how do we provide that in a way that gives people, regardless of demographic characteristics or income, access to the ballot. And that's an important thing. Well, I've been told our time is up, and so thank you very much.